Hi there, I'm John Holton from Newcastle University, and I'm going to be talking about Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC, one of the Greek depth studies on the GCSE ancient history. I want to do a few things in this short talk. Firstly, offer some general reflection about the key topics in this depth study with some specific notes on a few issues. One of the core pieces of archaeological evidence from the appendix of evidence on this depth study I want to talk in detail about and offer some ideas about how to interpret the significance of it. Wanted to point to a few chosen pieces of additional evidence that you might find useful in responding to some features in the key topics. And I wanted to end by giving some general advice about teaching Alexander the Great, which is based on my own experience of teaching at university level. So I've looked in the specification. I've seen the variety of different issues united by 4 key topics, and there's a lot there, and of course I can't talk about all of that in detail. What I wanted to focus on and give you a few takeaways for is the first key topic, and that's upbringing, character, and beliefs about the life of Alexander. And I'll say something specific about the underlying section there, Alexander's character and beliefs, including the adoption of Persian dress and customs. The first thing I want to say about this key topic is that our evidence is actually quite suspect. We don't have anything really secure that we know about what Alexander believed, what his character was, and even most of the details about his upbringing are obscured too. Most of this is owing to the fact that there's a lot of distortion in our main literary sources, given the fact that they were composed centuries after Alexander's own lifetime, but in a lot of cases there is deliberate moralization, deliberate mythologization about the figure of Alexander too. And Alexander's upbringing, his boyhood, is actually a key point for this kind of fictionalization. There's a good case in point in Plutarch's Biography of Alexander, which is one of the pieces of evidence in this depth study. A good case in point because it shows us the sheer variability about the kinds of stories of Alexander that we see in relation to these topics. So, for instance, about Alexander's birth and conception, you have a variety of different stories all told in conjunction, and you're not sure which one is true. And in fact, most of them are mythicizing and fanciful. What's also true is that Alexander was written about extensively in antiquity, and his story was written and rewritten many, many times over the generations between his lifetime and the dates of the sources that we actually have still surviving. And Arrian, who's the most well used of the Alexander sources we have left, even says that by his time, in the 1st, 2nd century AD, there was more written about Alexander that was more mutually conflicting than about any other historical figure. So even by Arrian's time, 500 years after Alexander's death, there is a lot of conflicting information about Alexander. The specific issue of Alexander's character and beliefs, including the adoption of Persian dress and customs, struck me as slightly unusual because maybe I don't really see much of a connection between the adoption of Persian dress and customs with Alexander's character and beliefs. I think it might be more useful to frame this as primarily a political act, that is, dressing up like a Persian or a royal Persian. It's a political act, not necessarily relating to anything that Alexander believed. And in that sense, it was probably more an attempt to win over the Persian nobility, an existing elite class which knew how to govern the vast Persian Empire, rather than an idea of Alexander's personality being subdued by decadent Eastern style, which is very often the trope that we find in our literary sources and indeed modern retellings too. There's a useful idea in scholarship to this effect. Pierre Brion suggested that Alexander is effectively the last of the Achaemenid kings, inasmuch as he governed pretty much the same size of empire. He used many of the same structures for ruling that empire and even dressed like a Persian king. So there's a huge amount of continuity between Alexander and the Persian kings that preceded him, and a lot of this was down for pragmatic political reasons. Dressing like a Persian monarch was an obvious way of taking up the rulership of the Persian Empire. I had a look in the specification too at the literary evidence. I've mentioned that a couple of times already. Some of that is fairly straightforward. It's narrative. I thought it might be useful to focus on the archaeological evidence, which is perhaps a little bit more difficult to interpret if you don't have experience of that form of evidence. I thought this one in particular might be a good one to talk about, a Babylonian astronomical diary tablet mentioning the Battle of Gaugamela. So this particular diary, it's in the British Museum. I've provided you the web link there. It's a monthly account of astronomical phenomena happening in the vicinity of Babylonia in the particular month that the Battle of Gaugamela took place in 331 BC. And it's writing in cuneiform, that's the Babylonian script, on a lump of clay, which is then baked and hardened and saved as a record. You've got various references to Alexander in the course of recording what's going on certain days of that month. There's a few of them, but I've accepted here. I've given some extensive bullet points about these, so I'll gloss over them so that I don't run over time, but you'll have the information on your screen to take away nonetheless. So the first reference to Alexander in this Babylonian astronomical diary is the direct reference to the Battle of Gaugamela. It talks about the clash between Darius and the invader Alexander, and it talks about how Darius's troops fled him, and so Alexander won the day. What's really important about this is it offers a counterpoint to the information that we get in our principal literary sources. So Arrian, Plutarch, and another historian called Quintus Curtius Rufus all talk about how Darius himself fled the site of battle, and that's why, the Persian army lost the day. Whereas you have this contemporary record produced in Babylonia itself after the battle, saying that actually Darius's troops fled him, and that's why he lost. You have this agreeing with another of the Alexander historians, Diodorus Siculus, and I think on balance it's probably right here. So you've probably got distortion in our source tradition here. Darius didn't lose because he fled, he lost because his troops fled. And there's all sorts of issues you can explore there about why Darius is cast in such a negative way in a lot of our sources about Alexander. So what's important about this source is it can act as an external control on the testimony of subjective literary histories, and it actually materially affects our understanding in this specific case in point. There's a couple of other references in this astronomical diary to how Alexander's making overtures to the people of Babylonia. Some specific things he does there. He guarantees property rights and takes part in local religious ceremonies. All of this suggests an attempt to win over the Babylonian people for his impending rule, and they offer a nice counterpoint to the usual things we get about military conquest. So Alexander's campaigns is obviously a story of military conquest, but it's also a story about interactions with a wide series of different local peoples who are won over in different ways, not just they are conquered and thereafter ruled over. So you see behind the scenes here to some of the transactions that are taking place in order to make sure these people are buying into Alexander's rule. Now, of course, this doesn't apply for the entirety of Alexander's reign, but there is a record of this kind of behavior up to this point. You can point to examples in Egypt, examples in Asia Minor. So again, some useful material here that you don't get in some of our literary sources. I wanted to point to a couple of other additional pieces of evidence that might be useful for this specific issue in the second key topic, and that's the initial reasons for the Persian expedition, the initial reasons for going to war against Persian Empire in the first place. Philip II, Alexander's father, who had, defeated most of Greece by the time of his death in 336 BC, had enrolled the majority of Greek city-states into a common alliance called the League of Corinth, whose primary aim was basically securing a common Greek expedition against the Persian Empire. This is the project that Alexander inherited when he came to the throne in 336 BC, although he did face rebellion from a certain number of Greek city-states, prominently Thebes, and so he had to work to re-establish those bonds of alliance with the Greek city-states. One of the prime ideologies that Philip articulated as a reason for invading the Persian Empire was supposedly revenge for the Persian Wars in the 490s and the 480s BC, in which a number of Greek temples, like the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis in Athens, were desecrated. Another ideology was liberation of the Greek cities which were under Persian control in Asia Minor, so that's the western coast of modern-day Turkey. In this context, we can look at other pieces of evidence like this, which you won't see normally in your specification. And this is a gold coin, or a series of gold coins that's produced by Alexander from the very earliest years of his reign. So scholars think this coin's produced in 336, 335 BC. It shows on its obverse a helmeted head of the goddess Athena, and on its reverse the winged goddess Nike, personified victory, who's holding a victory wreath, and a stylus, which is a representation of a ship's mast. Obviously, the image of Nike, auspicious image in the context of building an alliance to fight against Persia. It's the image of Athena, which is more resonant in context, partially because it seems to be based on the helmeted image of Athena, which was popular on coins produced in the city of Corinth. So what you probably have is a copying of this Corinthian Athena, so Corinth, the seat of the Pan-Hellenic Greek alliance for invading Persia, copying of this Corinthian Athena to symbolize Greek unity. So the users of this coin would probably understand this kind of message. So this works in context. You also have other pieces of evidence like this inscription from the town of Prairie in Asia Minor, a Greek city which pre-existed Alexander's conquests, which Alexander interacted with. He did various things like build a temple, or pay for the building of a temple rather. We also have records that he sent a decree to the city decreeing that the Greeks in the city would be free and autonomous. They wouldn't pay tribute to him, and they would own their own property, whereas non-Greeks in the city would be bound to him. He would own their territory, and they would pay tribute to him. So there's an obvious distinction of status between Greeks and non-Greeks here, and I think that's all bound up in that initial idea behind invading the Persian Empire as to liberate the Greeks. So evidence like this can nicely inform us about that too. And again, you won't see that in your specification. I provided some links to some further useful resources that you might look at, a couple of the principal literary sources, including Diodorus Siculus, which I do think offers an interesting additional narrative to that usually provided by Arrian. You've got coin collections which you can look at. The coins that I talked about here were all taken from there. I've also given you a link to some translations with scholarly commentary on some Babylonian chronicles which mention Alexander the Great. So that might be quite interesting to look at in addition to that Astronomical Diary tablet. I wanted to end on a note of providing some general advice about teaching Alexander. A lot of this is quite self-explanatory. Provide a chronological framework early on, return to it in more focused intervals. So do a general outline first, and then focus on chunks of content as you go along. Basic scaffolding stuff. Keeping a glossary of key names is really important for keeping track of what's going on. Using maps wherever possible to contextualize what's being discussed for the students. Where is Tyre? Where is Babylonia? And where are we at in the context of Alexander's campaigns by this point? Other issues there, understanding Alexander's military issues. Really important there is putting him into the context of his father Philip II's reign, because it's Philip II who overhauled the Macedonian military and made it into the fighting force that Alexander used to conquer Persian Empire. Looking at different evidence types together is always a piece of advice of mine in teaching Alexander, because it gives you multiple perspectives on different issues. Like in that example of the Astronomical Diary tablet, I think that's really important for getting to grips with Alexander, that we're seeing different viewpoints. And my personal preference, downplay the romanticism, puncture that image of Alexander as a romantic hero adventuring off in the East, and focus on the historical stuff that's actually going on, the good and the bad. So I think those are my key takeaways based on my own experience of teaching at university level. They won't all be applicable, but hopefully they will be useful. This has been a bit of a whistle stop, but if you want to talk any more about this, I'd be happy to discuss it with you further. There's my email address. Feel free to get in contact, and of course I'll be around for the Q&A session too. Thank you very much.